When people hear the phrase, "homes cheaper than cars," most assume it's clickbait. But across forgotten corners of Appalachia, there are still towns where longtime locals quietly trade properties at prices that wouldn't cover a new pickup truck. And the reason these places exist has very little to do with ugliness or danger, and everything to do with how modern America has restructured itself. In many of these towns, the streets tell a story of a different economic era. Brick storefronts, built when coal trains ran day and night, wide porches designed for evenings without air conditioning, and houses constructed to last generations rather than flip cycles. What locals understand, and outsiders usually miss, is that price alone doesn't define value here. It reflects distance from major job hubs, population decline after single industry collapses, and a lifestyle that prioritizes stability over speed. In these towns, it's still possible to buy a solid 3-bedroom house for less than the price of a used SUV. Not because the home is falling apart, but because demand never returned after factories closed and younger generations moved away. Schools still operate, diners still open at dawn, and neighbors still know each other's names. Yet national buyers ignore these places because they don't fit the modern narrative of growth. That disconnect is exactly why locals continue to buy quietly. They understand that land doesn't evaporate, houses don't stop being useful, and communities don't vanish just because Wall Street stops paying attention. In many Appalachian towns, the housing stock is old, but overbuilt thick walls, hardwood floors, and layouts meant for large families created during times when the local economy was strong enough to justify permanence. When those economies contracted, prices collapsed, but the physical structures remained, waiting for people who value space, privacy, and low overhead over nightlife and convenience. What makes these towns especially overlooked is that they don't market themselves. There are no glossy brochures promising the next boom, no influencer-driven relocation campaigns, and no speculative frenzy. Locals buy because they need a roof, land to garden, and a place where taxes don't suffocate fixed incomes. Many buyers are retirees downsizing from cities, remote workers who value silence over coffee chains, or lifelong residents consolidating family properties as older relatives pass on. The cars cost more because transportation is essential here. Homes cost less because abundance outpaces demand. Another key factor is that these towns never experienced the pandemic-era surge that pushed prices sky-high elsewhere. While suburban and exurban markets exploded due to remote work migration, Appalachian towns stayed flat or even declined, reinforcing their forgotten label. That stability, however, also means they avoided dramatic corrections. Prices didn't crash because they never inflated. In these communities, ownership is practical rather than speculative. People buy homes to live in them, not to flip or rent at aggressive yields. Infrastructure exists, but isn't flashy. Basic healthcare, local schools, regional hospitals within driving distance, and road networks built long ago for industrial transport. For buyers accustomed to urban pricing psychology, it feels surreal to see a livable house listed for a figure that barely registers as a down payment elsewhere. Yet locals aren't surprised. They've lived with this reality for decades. What outsiders often fail to grasp is that low prices don't automatically signal hopelessness. They often indicate equilibrium in places where expectations are realistic and growth is measured in years, not quarters. These towns don't promise rapid appreciation, but they offer something increasingly rare: financial breathing room. A buyer can own outright, eliminate rent or mortgage stress, and redirect income toward healthcare, family, or simply living. That's why locals keep buying before outsiders arrive, not out of secrecy, but out of understanding. They know that once broader attention turns toward affordability again, these markets won't stay invisible forever. When that happens, prices won't skyrocket overnight, but the era of cheaper than cars will quietly fade, replaced by modest competition and rising taxes. Until then, these Appalachian towns remain pockets of economic gravity, where cost reflects use rather than hype, and where buying a home is still a grounded decision instead of a financial gamble. What really separates these forgotten Appalachian towns from other cheap places across the country is not just the price tag on the house, but the way life actually functions once you live there. Because affordability only matters if it doesn't come with constant friction. And in many of these towns, the day-to-day reality is far more stable than outsiders expect. One of the biggest reasons homes cost less than cars here is that the local economy never pivoted toward speculation. When major industries declined, prices adjusted downward and then stayed there instead of bouncing back artificially. That created a housing environment where ownership is normalized, not aspirational. In these towns, it's common for families to own multiple properties passed down through generations, which keeps inventory circulating locally instead of being locked up by investors. When a home hits the market, it's often priced to sell to someone who will actually live there, not someone trying to squeeze returns. That cultural difference matters because it keeps prices anchored to wages and pensions rather than outside capital. Another factor is property size and density. Appalachian towns were often built with space in mind: larger lots, detached homes, yards for gardens, sheds, and workshops, which increases maintenance responsibility but also increases autonomy. For locals, that trade-off makes sense. For outsiders used to low-maintenance urban living, it can feel intimidating. That intimidation keeps demand low, which in turn keeps prices suppressed. Utilities and services are basic but functional. You won't find luxury amenities on every corner, but you'll find reliable water, power, trash service, and often faster internet than people assume, especially in areas upgraded over the last decade. Healthcare access is usually regional rather than hyperlocal, meaning residents are accustomed to driving for specialists while relying on nearby clinics for routine care. This setup works well for retirees and remote workers who don't need daily proximity to major job centers. Transportation plays an outsized role in why homes are cheaper than cars, because vehicles are essential tools here, not optional conveniences. People spend more on trucks and SUVs because they need reliability in hilly terrain, winter weather, and long-distance errands. That spending pattern flips. The normal urban logic: housing is cheap because land is plentiful, while transportation costs rise because mobility is non-negotiable. Another overlooked piece is taxes. In many Appalachian towns, property taxes remain low due to depressed valuations and limited municipal spending. That means owning a home outright doesn't slowly bleed you through annual increases the way it does in high-growth areas. Insurance costs also tend to be manageable compared to coastal or wildfire-prone regions, which further reduces long-term ownership pressure. When people run the numbers, they realize that even if appreciation is slow, the cost of holding the property is so low that the math still works in their favor. Social structure also plays a role in sustaining these markets. These towns tend to have strong informal networks, neighbors helping neighbors, family connections, local tradespeople who work on trust rather than contracts. That reduces repair costs, improves safety, and creates resilience that doesn't show up in listings or statistics. For outsiders, this can feel unfamiliar at first, but it's one of the reasons locals stay even when opportunities elsewhere exist. Another reason prices remain low is perception lag. Appalachia still carries outdated stereotypes that scare away buyers who've never spent time there. Those narratives persist even as reality changes slowly on the ground. Some towns have improved broadband, small business activity, and public spaces, but because they aren't aggressively marketing themselves, the perception gap remains wide. That gap is exactly where affordability lives. It's also why locals tend to buy quietly and steadily rather than in waves. They aren't reacting to headlines. They're responding to life events: marriage, retirement, inheritance, downsizing. This keeps transaction volume low and predictable, preventing price spikes. Importantly, these towns are not frozen. They are aging, adapting, and reshaping at a pace that suits their residents. Schools may be smaller, but they are often deeply integrated into the community. Local governments operate on lean budgets, which limits expansion but also prevents reckless development that could destabilize housing costs. For buyers who measure quality of life by peace, control, and low financial pressure, these conditions are not drawbacks, they're features. And this is why the homes cheaper than cars reality persists. It's not a glitch. It's the result of decades of economic adjustment settling into equilibrium. As long as these towns remain overlooked by mass migration trends, prices will stay grounded. But as affordability becomes a national obsession again, That equilibrium will eventually attract new eyes. The locals buying now understand that timing isn't about flipping or cashing out. It's about locking in a lifestyle that may not be replicable once broader demand arrives. That's why these towns aren't empty, abandoned places. They're quietly lived-in communities operating below the national radar, where value is measured in usability rather than hype, and where the idea of owning a home outright is still normal, not nostalgic. As you look closer at why these Appalachian towns remain so inexpensive, another layer starts to appear. And it has less to do with the houses themselves and more to do with how modern America assigns value to places. Because value today is often driven by visibility rather than livability, and these towns have almost none of the former. They sit outside major media narratives, far from tech corridors, tourism branding, or lifestyle marketing, which means they aren't constantly being rediscovered or repackaged for outsiders. That invisibility acts like a shield. While other rural or small-town areas saw waves of pandemic-era buyers flood in chasing space and affordability, many Appalachian towns were bypassed entirely, not because they lacked beauty or function, but because they lacked buzz. Without buzz, there's no bidding war. Without bidding wars, prices stay tied to reality. Another major reason homes remain cheaper than cars here is the ownership mindset. In many of these communities, a house is viewed as shelter first, asset second, if at all. People don't talk about appreciation, equity, or exit strategies. They talk about roofs, heating systems, and whether the land floods in spring. That practical mindset filters into pricing. Sellers list based on what feels fair locally, not what someone from outside might pay, and buyers negotiate based on use, not fear of missing out. This creates a market that moves slowly but honestly. You don't see sudden spikes or collapses. You see long stretches of flat pricing with small, incremental changes. For outsiders used to volatility, that flatness can feel unsettling, but for locals, it represents predictability. Another factor keeping prices suppressed is renovation economics. Many homes are older, and while they're often structurally sound, they may need updates that don't make financial sense in a high-priced market mindset. In cities, spending $50,000 on renovations might be justified by a $150,000 increase in value. In these Appalachian towns, renovations are done for comfort, not resale, because resale math rarely supports over-improvement. That discourages speculative flipping and keeps housing aligned with actual needs rather than projected profits. It also means buyers who are willing to live with dated kitchens or do gradual improvements can get far more value than those chasing turnkey perfection. Land availability also plays a quiet role. Unlike densely packed metros, many Appalachian towns still have space-empty lots, unused parcels, and homes that were built when population expectations were higher. That surplus keeps prices from rising aggressively because scarcity never fully sets in. Even when a nice property sells quickly, there's usually another one not far behind. Scarcity psychology never takes hold, and without it, prices struggle to rise beyond what locals can afford. Another overlooked aspect is time. Life in these towns moves slower, and that affects real estate behavior. Homes stay on the market longer without stigma. Price reductions aren't viewed as failure, just adjustment. Buyers don't feel rushed, and sellers don't feel insulted by negotiation. That patience removes urgency from transactions, and urgency is what inflates prices elsewhere. Infrastructure investment patterns also matter. These towns rarely see sudden injections of outside capital that transform neighborhoods overnight. Improvements happen gradually. Road repairs, school upgrades, small downtown revitalizations, often funded through local or regional efforts rather than massive redevelopment projects. That incremental change improves livability without triggering displacement or speculative buying. For residents, this means life gets a little better each year without becoming unaffordable. For buyers, it means you're not racing against developers or institutional investors. Another reason prices stay low is that these towns often lack strong rental arbitrage potential. Short-term rentals aren't a major driver, either due to limited tourism or local resistance, which keeps investor demand muted. Long-term rentals exist, but rents reflect local incomes, not outside demand. This limits how much investors are willing to pay up front, which again anchors prices. When homes don't pencil out as high-yield investments, they remain accessible to people who just want to live in them. There's also a generational dynamic at play. As older residents age or pass on, properties are often sold within extended families or to acquaintances rather than listed nationally. This informal transfer keeps prices grounded and reduces competition. Even when homes are publicly listed, the buyer pool is usually local or regional, not national. That keeps expectations realistic. Importantly, none of this means these towns are immune to change. As affordability becomes a bigger national issue, some of these places will eventually attract more attention. Remote work, early retirement, and cost of living pressure will slowly pull new residents in. But because the baseline is so low, change will likely come as gradual stabilization rather than explosive growth. Prices may rise modestly, but the cheaper-than-cars era won't end overnight. That's why locals who buy now aren't betting on a boom, they're securing control. They're locking in housing costs that will never again be this low relative to national standards. And that's the key insight most outsiders miss. The value here isn't in future upside, it's in present-day freedom. When housing costs fall below transportation costs, life rearranges itself around people rather than payments. Stress drops, choices expand. And in a world where most people feel priced out of stability, that quiet advantage is exactly why these Appalachian towns remain lived in, quietly bought, and stubbornly undervalued. The final piece of understanding why these forgotten Appalachian towns still offer homes that cost less than cars comes down to expectations. Because these places were never designed to compete with modern ideas of growth, prestige, or acceleration. And once you stop measuring them by the wrong standards, their value becomes obvious in a way that feels almost uncomfortable in today's economy. These towns don't sell a dream of becoming rich. They sell a reality of staying afloat without constant pressure. And that's why the people who thrive here are usually the ones who come in with clarity instead of fantasy. Life in these communities rewards self-sufficiency, patience, and realism. If someone arrives expecting rapid appreciation, trendy amenities, or nonstop convenience, they'll probably feel disappointed. But if they arrive looking for control over expenses, ownership without leverage, and the ability to live without every decision being dictated by money, these towns quietly over-deliver. One of the most important shifts that happens when housing costs drop this low is psychological. When you don't owe a bank hundreds of thousands of dollars, your relationship with work changes. People become more selective about jobs, more willing to work locally or remotely, and less afraid of income fluctuations. That flexibility is incredibly valuable in regions where traditional employment opportunities may be limited but not absent. Instead of chasing high wages to survive, residents focus on lowering expenses, so moderate income becomes sufficient. This inversion of the typical financial model is what makes these towns resilient even when broader economies struggle. Another crucial aspect is how community functions when ownership is widespread. In places where most residents own outright or nearly so, neighborhoods behave differently. There's less turnover, less absentee ownership, and fewer hollowed-out blocks. People invest time instead of capital. They fix things slowly, help each other, and think in decades rather than quarters. That long-term mindset stabilizes towns that outsiders assume are fragile. It's also why sudden gentrification doesn't happen easily here. Without strong speculative demand, change comes gradually and locally, not explosively. That protects affordability, but also filters newcomers. People who move in tend to stay, because leaving doesn't offer a clear upgrade when you already own your home outright. Another reason these towns persist is that they don't rely on external validation. They aren't chasing rankings, awards, or attention. They exist for the people who live there, not for headlines. That lack of branding is exactly what keeps them affordable. Once a town starts marketing itself as the next hidden gem, prices respond quickly. These Appalachian towns haven't crossed that threshold yet, which is why the gap between cost and utility remains so wide. But that invisibility won't last forever. As housing affordability continues to deteriorate nationally, more people will widen their search radius, and some will inevitably land here. When that happens, the dynamic will shift, not dramatically, but meaningfully. Prices won't skyrocket overnight, But the era of extreme undervaluation will begin to close. Locals understand this intuitively. They aren't hoarding properties out of greed, they're securing stability in a system that increasingly punishes renters and late entrants. That's why many purchases happen quietly, through word of mouth or family networks, long before listings reach national platforms. Another key insight is that these towns don't need growth to survive. They need continuity. They need enough people to keep schools open, clinics staffed, and businesses operating. In that context, even small inflows of residents can have an outsized positive impact without disrupting affordability. That's a fundamentally different growth model than the one driving crises elsewhere. It's slow, grounded, and largely invisible, but it works. The biggest mistake outsiders make is assuming low prices mean low standards. In reality, standards are simply different. Space is prioritized over polish, privacy over proximity, ownership over liquidity. Once you adjust your lens, the numbers stop looking alarming and start looking logical. A house costs less than a car because the house is a tool for living, not a financial instrument. The car costs more because mobility is essential. That inversion only feels strange if you're conditioned to think housing must always be the most expensive part of life. In these towns, it isn't, and that's the point. What ultimately determines whether these places remain affordable isn't whether outsiders discover them, but whether they understand them. People who arrive trying to force urban expectations onto rural systems often leave disappointed. People who arrive willing to adapt usually stay and integrate. That filtering effect slows change and protects the communities from being overwhelmed. It also ensures that when prices do rise, they do so gradually, anchored by real use rather than speculation. The window where homes cost less than cars exists because demand hasn't caught up to reality yet. But history shows that affordability never stays invisible forever. When the gap between cost and livability becomes too obvious, attention follows. That's why these towns matter now, not as get-rich opportunities, but as reminders that the American housing story isn't uniform. There are still places where ownership is normal, stress is optional, and life is built around people instead of payments. Once that realization spreads, the numbers will change. Until then, these Appalachian towns remain exactly what they've always been: quiet, functional, and undervalued by a system that forgot how to measure worth without hype.